So we are going to live. Lefrandi will lead us, two of our guests. And after the session, may I ask you to stay in the Zoom for a little bit? We want to pray for you before the meeting. Yeah.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Oh. Oke. Ya, selamat malam. Kita dari Belajar Teologi bisa berjumpa kembali dengan kalian. Seperti biasa kita akan bersama-sama mendiskusikan, kita akan sama-sama mendengarkan topik yang menarik, begitu ya, tentang teologi. Dan hari ini saya tidak sendiri, saya bersama dengan rekan-rekan saya yang ada Hendra, ada juga Lefrandi, dan secara khusus hari ini saya juga kedatangan seorang tamu yang akan ikut siswa MTH dari STT saat gitu. Here and all of you to this session. It's my pleasure to be a moderator for this session. The end, and what youth workers should do about it. First of all, I briefly introduce you our speaker and responder for tonight's session. Ruth is Carrie Olson, Professor of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary. He teaches classes on youth ministry, young adults, family, church, and culture, all with a deep theological bent. Ruth also was the principal leader of the $1.2 million John Templeton Foundation grant called Science for Youth Ministry. He publishes many articles and books about youth, and you may visit his blog on www.andrewroot.org. Good morning, Professor Root. We are so pleased and probably include ministry center. It's good.
Waduh, koneksiku kacau. Oh my goodness. Waduh, gawat men. Koneksiku unstable.
Iya, kamar ini kayaknya memang begitu. Dulu sebelumnya begini juga.
For the rest of the time, I will open the Q&A session for those who want to raise some questions. Okay, that's my introduction. Professor Ruth, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, it is really great to be early in hopefully the fog of my early morning will not the in this will make sense. But it is a really great pleasure to talk with you all, and thank you so much for the kind words and reading my books. It's very much an honor. So, talking about this book, The End of Youth Ministry, the first thing I have to say is a few things about the book. Is one, where it's born out of, that this was not a book originally that I planned on writing or even hoped to write. I was actually told that I needed to write this book. I was part of a large grant at Yale Divinity School's Center for Faith and Culture. And they had a project on human flourishing, on joy in human flourishing, which is one of the kind of peculiarities of this book, is that particularly towards the end of it, joy is a kind of central theme of how we think about joy. So there we were doing a lot of different work on joy. Added a wing in this grant that would focus on young people and the church and young people on it. And they told me that I was invited onto the grant team. That I would at first not seem like a fell in love with it. The book definitely represents my and how I'm trying to make sense of youth history
Aku nggak mau pakai
midst
internet
of
sekarang.
a changing world. Now, the book was
Aku
published
begitu, tapi ini tiba-tiba
March
kacau.
2020. And I come up with the
Mati
title,
tiba-tiba.
The End
Aku
of
host
Youth
nih, aku
Ministry.
connect
That was the
begitu.
publisher. My only contribution was to put the question so that none of you mad at me if I said it was the end of youth ministry. So it's a question. Is it the end? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So that's my only contribution. But I will say that the book came out March 2020, and I had no idea that at least in North America with the pandemic, that youth ministry quite literally end in many places. So I don't know. There's maybe a prophetic element to this in a bad way. So I should have,
Kalau
and
iyo,
treasure
aku
after
nggak tahu juga. Tiba-tiba keluar tadi, Rek.
really
Untuk nggak masuk lagi.
comes from. And the
Ojo telepon, ojo telepon.
subtitle says it's about parenting, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to be on this chat and in conversation with those of you on YouTube, and then of course people in this Zoom room, is just thinking about how much this is embedded, at least in my imagination, in North American middle class parenting practice. And I do think there's an interesting conversation we should have and think about as we are having a global conversation right now about youth ministry, and having a conversation across context, is how much the conversations about youth ministry have been embedded in a certain American form of the church and in the middle class reality. And I think that becomes something that we should just really be aware of. And this book is trying to really explore that and to unmask it a little bit and say that too much youth ministry in America has been focused mainly on middle class folks, people with some kind of privilege. And particularly what's happened in the last decade is the parenting practice has changed. And a certain deep irony has happened in America that is kind of, for those of us who have been in the youth ministry game for a while here in North America, are kind of shocked by, which in the 90s and even the early 2000s, we really thought the big issue was parent apathy, that parents just weren't that engaged in their kids' lives. They just didn't seem to care about what was going on with their kids, and their kids were just kind of roaming for hoods. But in the last decade, what this book tries to put, we've had a major parenting practice switch, and that parents are not kind of permissive in just letting their kids do whatever they want, that they're very deeply involved in their life, that they're getting involved in all sorts of activities and all sorts of different opportunities, and are with them, spending a great deal of time with them around these activities. And yet the irony is that the more engaged these parents have been, church, particularly youth ministry, has been a major staple of their life. So as parents become more engaged, the involvement in youth ministry actually seems, in the broadest way, to go down. And that's just a really interesting phenomenon, because at least here in North America, we always thought if we could get parents really engaged, then, well, faith formation would just happen. Then our youth group be strong and things like that. And it's in this weird kind of paradox. It's worked the other way. So I started for this book interviewing parents, and again, these were I live in the middle of the country. I'm in the middle of a very cold part right now of the United States, about 6 hours north. So I interviewed some people in my area to just talk to on why they made decisions the way they did. And I don't know rigorous social scientific study. I think of my interviews more as like a screenwriter, doing a drive along with a police officer to write a movie about police officers or something. So it could be a deeper study, but I wanted to really get a flavor of how parents were making decisions, how they thought about faith formation of their own children. So I interviewed these folks, and they all were really engaged parents. And I interviewed some who thought church was the most important thing in their kids' lives. I interviewed others who really across the kind of, and some who were, they were willing for their kids to go to church. They liked it, but there were other activities that they thought were more important. And then I interviewed a set of parents who had never gone to church really, or hadn't gone to church, but maybe in Easter or Christmas every 5 or 10 years. And these people, I went to their house and they had three daughters, and they invited me into their house. Very kind people, and we just started to talk about their parenting practice and how they parented their kids. And their three daughters ranged from the ages of 12 to 15 or 16, and they explained that all three of their daughters were really invested in basketball. They all played basketball. They were on very advanced basketball teams, and both mom and dad coached these basketball teams. So dad coached two of the teams, and mom coached one. And they then explained to me that basically their whole life is basketball, that they have at least two practices a night every night of the week. And on the weekends, they play in tournaments, and they will have 4 or 5 games every weekend day. So the dad said, really, our life is just basketball, laundry, and repeat. That's all we do is play basketball. And I was really shocked. I mean, I was actually pretty moved by this because I thought, I have two children. I have a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old, and I was just impressed with how much that I don't think I could spend this much time driving my kids around. But so I was impressed, but I think the mother took that as maybe a little bit of a criticism. And so she stopped me and said, well, wait, I should be clear. Like, I know we seem basketball crazed, but you don't have to play basketball in our family. You can do anything. And then she told me that her middle daughter said that she didn't want to play soccer. In their second sport after basketball season was soccer. And she said she didn't want to play soccer. And mom said that she said to her middle daughter, well, that's fine. You don't have to play soccer. But what do you want to do? And the middle daughter said, well, I don't want to do anything. I just don't want to do anything. And then mom told me that she said to her daughter, that's not an option. In this family, you have to do something. You have to be involved in some kind of activity. And then the mom said these words. She said, it's really important that our daughter finds her thing. Her thing is really important. She's got to find her thing. So she has to be involved in all this stuff so she can find her thing. And all the parents I interviewed, this word kept coming up. They need to find their thing. And it seemed like every parent thought that their major emphasis was how to figure out what their thing was. Really into computers and coding, whatever it might be, it was really important that they really find their thing. And I think that had two reasons for it. It wasn't just a kind of benign, we want to keep our kids busy. It was more than that. It had a deep sense that if their own children were going to thrive in the future, if they were going to live a good life, that they needed to find their thing. So it came out of these dynamics. One was helping your kid find their thing, and therefore investing your time, your energy, your money, and getting your kid involved in all of these activities. A major piece of it was helping your kid actually be able to articulate their identity. Who am I? To answer the question, who am I? And this is a conversation I would love to have with you all, because one of the things that we are dealing with in North America is what the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor calls the age of authenticity, that we're living inside an age of authenticity. And he actually thinks this is an ethic of authenticity. It's not a pure kind of hedonism. There's an ethic here. And the ethic of authenticity that is really all over the North American context says this. It says that every human being has a right to define for themselves what it means to be human. And no human being should ever tell another human being what it means for them to live their own life. Every individual has a right to define for themselves what it means to be human. And this is just kind of in the air we breathe right now in North America. And it was really fascinating to watch these parents try to raise their children inside of a deep kind of ethos of the age of authenticity. How do you parent when you can't really impose on your kid what their identity should be? That in some sense you have to just let it arise. So in America, at least, in the middle class, it's kind of assumed that if you're a 15-year-old or 16-year-old or 13-year-old, maybe you watch videos, you come out of your room and you make the statement to your family, to your friends on social media. You say, this is me, this is who. Hard if good, that in quotes, a good parent, that the good parent will accept that. will embrace that, will not push back. And we don't see ourselves that way in this kind of family. That would violate the ethic of authenticity. Another human being in life, the good parent will always be 100. That's a huge kind of anxious task for most North Americans, because you can't violate that ethic of authenticity, but at the same time, you have a child in your house trying to figure out who they are, and you can't impose too many values on them. So what can you do? Well, it seems like, at least in my research, what parents do is they get their kids involved in all sorts of activities. They help them find their thing. You may not be able to tell your kid who she is, but if you get her really involved in gymnastics, she'll be able to see herself as someone who does gymnastics. You get them really involved in a choir, the choir will inform them of who they are. So the thing becomes really important for their identity. But it had the second dynamic too, as I talked to these parents. And the second dynamic was it really did have this deep sense of what it meant to live a good life. That parents were so deeply invested in their children being involved in all sorts of activities, and giving them a menu of different activities to be part of to help them find their thing, because they really wanted to help their children live a good life. And the idea was that the way you move towards the good life is to be able to accrue resources and opportunities and to open doors through this involvement in the thing. So I try in the book to really explore this sense that it has been in philosophy as well in theology, about how human flourishing works, and how are these weird kind of creatures, uniquely weird creatures who really care about living a good life. That we don't think, I don't know, I don't throw any shade, and I don't know what dolphins are thinking of. I'll say, dolphins aren't having deep conversations, but I've never that there's, a university made up of dolphins or something. Dolphins are pretty smart creatures, really care about living a good life. That we're woken up in the middle of the night feeling like we've missed it, that we've missed living a good life. That what it means to be human in many ways is to try to be drawn towards the good, connected to the good. And we get it wrong often, and we could miss out on in the wrong way. But we desire that. We desire to live a good life. And even the way we address each other often has this kind of sense of the good life underneath it. We ask people, are you there? And things like that. And when I meet my neighbors on my street, they'll say, hey, are your kids good? Are your kids doing good? And they are essentially asking, are your kids connected? Are they directed towards? Are they aimed good life? And how I answer as a parent is I usually, so I say, oh yeah, Owen is doing great. He's really advancing in piano, and my daughter Maisie, she's doing really well too. She's running track, and it's going really well, and her times are getting better. We tend to repeat the activities that our kids are involved in. And I do wonder, and one of you may at some day want to do this, but I think that there would be a really interesting study to explore how our models of youth ministry, our kind of imaginations of youth ministry, change around our moral imaginations. When our moral frameworks change, so do our views of ministry. And so just to give you a few examples of this, and particularly kind of Northern Hemisphere, North American examples of this, if you were to go back in the time machine, which I don't think Zoom has that feature, the time machine feature, but that would be, but if we were able to go back in time to the 18th century in England and ask, hey, are the kids good to the church? The response we would have gotten was, well, we're not sure. We're not sure if the kids are doing well. We're afraid that as industrialization has come to the English shores, we're quite worried that that they can't read and write, that we have a whole generation of young people who can't read and can't write, and particularly can't read their Bibles. So we get this new youth ministry form that a lot of us with from Robert Reichs called the Sunday School movement. And if you were to ask the question in North America in the early 19th century, you were to ask, hey, are the kids okay? Are the kids doing good? Are the kids good? The response we would have gotten was, well, we're not sure. It doesn't seem like they're that committed. And everyone is moving off of farms and on to integrate. So you get the creation of different youth ministry forms. You get something called Christian Endeavor, which is this North American youth ministry form, where kids pledged their commitments to the Christian story. And then you also get something that is global. You get the creation of the YMCA. You get this creation of the YMCA. Well, after World War II in the 1970s, asked the question to are the kids good? The rotten is, well, they have all these new suburbs, and it seems to be safe environments. Work of being and having all sorts of free time. And so youth ministry, the kind of youth ministry that was, as a youth group, youth ministry became the youth group, and it blow kids down to essentially say, don't try to be an adult too quickly. Let's just gather at our church and let's have fun. And this is the kind of common youth ministry kind of reality. If you read back from the 1980s, even the mid 1970s of American youth ministry publications, a lot of it is about how you just do mixers and get people together. I mean, we used to have a whole company, a very big company in the United States that just provided those kind of resources because youth group was really about, that's all changed. And we don't have a kind of parenting style in North America anymore where it's permissive, where it's just, hey, just go, do whatever you want. There's not much going on. Quote, best parents who give their children just a menu of activities and are with them at all points. And they're doing so many different things. And so many of our young people are just trying to and then going this for volunteering at this service, and they're doing all of these things. And so at some point with that menu of activities, they have to be ranked. You have to rank which are the most important. In youth ministry, the youth group itself just gets pushed down the scale. In North America, parents still think it's a good thing for their kids to go to church. They think it's a good thing. That'd be great if we could do it. But when it comes a conflict of, church or basketball, church or violin, church or just being rested for a big exam, the other thing over church. And why is that? And it has a big sense to do with how they view the good life, how the good life is, how their kids actually find their way into the good life and what those other activities provide. But what I've a lot of American youth workers is that they really feel like it's their job to try to get the youth ministry up the scale. That if it has to be ranked and youth group is number 3, well, if we could just do a great youth ministry program, if we had things, we could 7 or maybe even up to 5. And they work really hard to do that. And I think this maybe is the naive American kind of attitude, but there's a sense like where I'll hear things of, well, if kids will get up at 6 a.m. to study for their tests, then they should get up at 6 a.m. to read their Bibles. That you hear youth workers say those things. And I think that maybe is true, but I always try to, have compassion for those youth workers and pat them on the head and say, a good exam score, it's not better than all of these other activities. And it's because those other activities provide what the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa calls the AAA. It provides availability, accessibility, and attainability. And it particularly provides availability, accessibility, and attainability to the resources you might need to live whatever dream you want in the future. And so it's very hard for parents to understand how having their kid involved in a youth group could give them the kind of resources and experiences they might need to be able to get into a top university, or how it will help them be the happiest person that they could possibly have, a good test score, learning to play the violin with one of the best teachers in the city could provide them the resources to be whatever they want to be. Now, this moves us in a theological turn as I come to the conclusion of my time, because this shows that there's a problem. And at least in in North America, in the West, we have a major problem, which is that we're fundamentally these beings who need to live a good life. But the way we think about the good life is almost completely a projection. These activities are so important for parents because parents don't often know what the good life is. They don't know how to tell their kids what it means to really live life. We say, well, what is the good life? Most middle-class parents don't know. They don't know what it is, but they know that they want their kid to live it in the future. So the good life almost all becomes a projection into the future. The content of what it means to live well right now, what it means to live well as a Christian right now, this day to day. Most parents aren't preparing their kids for that. They're preparing them for something in the future, to live whatever dream they want. So to go back to Hartmut Rosa, he says, modern people, particularly talking about the West, he says, we're weird people. Because we're the kind of people that are like painters, where we keep setting up our easel and getting our palette just right, mixing the colors, going back to the store and buying new paintbrushes, setting those up, making sure our easel is hitting the sun in the right way, making sure all of our resources are organized so that we could paint a picture. And he says the one thing we never do is we never paint the picture. We just prepare to paint a picture, but never paint it. In other words, he means that as parents, middle-class parents give their kids all sorts of resources to live well. Soccer, volleyball, a tutor, a coach, all of these things are there. What it might mean to pray and to reflect, to read the scriptures, and what it might mean to seek of our world. So the place I would like to conclude, and hopefully we can have some discussion then, is that there's this deep temptation, if you're in youth ministry, to think your job is to kind of shine up and make more attractive the thing and fight the thing. But one of the really interesting realities here is that if we're talking about faith formation and we're driving towards thinking about how it is that young people encounter the living presence of Jesus Christ, do Jesus claim, the thing is not the powerful reality for transformation. The thing is there. We're all kind of social beings who do sorts of activities. But what's much more important than the thing is the story. The story is more important than the actual activity. The story is what what's fascinating about parents is they acted like, well, just whatever I want. They don't have to even do basketball. That's said. I knew our girls don't have to play basketball. They like basketball is a bunch of other things, but it wasn't true. Those girls couldn't butt pick because in that family, basketball was a deep, deep story. There was narrative all around it. There were rich stories within it. So, for instance, mom and dad fell in love at a basketball camp. They both played basketball all the way into university. Mom's father, the girl's grandfather, coached basketball in a small town in America for 30 years. The girls were there when he retired, and the whole town came out to celebrate his of basketball. If you would have asked those girls why they love basketball so much, they would have told you a story. The oldest daughter would have said, I love basketball because remember the first time in a game I shot a three-pointer. I remember I turned around and was running back on defense, and I looked up into the stands, and I saw my grandfather jumping up and down, and I thought to myself, I'm going to shoot 100 threes every day. They would have a deep story and a narrative. The truth of the matter is the way we're change, the way transformation happens, particularly inside the Christian story, is never absent a deep sense of narrative, a story. And so we even think about this. I mean, we've talked about identity, but what is like an identity crisis? You've probably seen a movie or someone in your life who goes through an identity home, note left on the counter, and say, I no longer love you, and I've moved away with my lover. The first thing that happens to read that note is they go into an identity crisis. They all of a sudden are like, I don't even know who I am anymore. I don't even know how to go forward now that this has been revealed. And it's very interesting that they say, I don't even know who I am anymore. Well, they didn't do the moral violation. They didn't do anything wrong. But what's happened is that they have lost the stories in which they lived. The stories that organized their lives have all been stripped away. The stories they thought of their life has been upended. So to have an identity, you always need stories. And inside the Christian proclamation is a fundamentally storied reality. It's all about stories. And in many ways, it's about the joy of living in and sharing in each other's stories. And so my focus for youth workers is that if we're going to count something, if we're going to be focused on something, instead of counting where our thing ranks, the youth group ranks amongst the whole list of things, we should focus instead on stories, on how it is we invite the congregation, the church community, to share their stories with young people, to ask young people to interpret those stories, to think about those stories, to make sense of those stories, to bring the scriptures in the tradition of the church alive as a story that asks young people to make sense of their lives around it. So this importance of story, I think, becomes very, very essential. So these practices where we might do something, this old Christian word might be recovered, where there might be testimony, becomes a place of transformation. It's the book that we can definitely talk about that I haven't touched on. Really is trying to explore moving away from youth ministry as the just have to get paid, and we need to make that families will be committed to remembering that we and what changes is in the way the gospel really moves is not as a thing, not even as an idea, but as the encounter of persons who narrate their lives to each other, who share their stories with each other. And in my mind, that's kind of how Paul thinks of his churches, the continued storying and reflecting on this living Jesus Christ who hasn't experience fundamental reality. I think I've maybe talked too long. And I'll remember campaign early in the year. I don't know if I made it. I don't know if it's for you. It just moves and my brain is trying to catch up. So we'll see if I made any sense.
Okay, thank you.
In Indonesia. So because they also deal with the age, the secular age, which Charles Taylor is just now quote, and also the digital age. So the activity we are trapped in, we are including in church activity. Like this doesn't change, although it change for kind. Physical become what from is that this kind of youth ministry is not cannot detach from the family ministries, right? So you put the parents as the very important point. Only how this parent put their position in this kind of the things. This is I also, as a parents of two young daughter, I also still confused whether I have to follow whatever they want or have to stick with my one in my age, or how. And plus the pandemic. So I think I don't know whether is there any some of the like ontological shift in human being regarding all these things and happen together.
Yeah.
They delayed all the room for the story which maybe happened in the previous moment.
Yeah.
And I believe that probably, if I'm not mistaken, in all everything now maybe focus. Read the chapter 12. Uh, uh, Laura, the story of thing,
Yep.
Lorena or Kat for their friend in the hospital, someone who's sick. This has become a waiting room. Hermanto, I think you remember. I also missed
the weird book, like so to be honest, it's a weird book because there's a story that plays through it, and a story even has a time jump and things like that. It's a very odd book. So there is this just occurs. Your question of the waiting room is this. Does this just happen, or do we plan for it? And I do think we do have to plan for it. Often when we look back on our ministries, the most profound realities just happened. But allowing things to just happen doesn't mean not planning for it. And so I think there are ways we can plan for it. We can't make what happens in that space we plan for as profound maybe as we hope it is. So at the very end of the book, I try to do this thing, tell a story about a group of young people who do gather and pray and rest together. And the way that even the waiting room experience lives on as young people gather and just try to interpret stories. What does it mean? What does it mean to live time? So I think that creates space really important. Another theory that I hadn't read when I wrote this book is there's a German Korean scholar named Byung-Chul Han who's written this incredibly he's written a number of different books, but one of his most famous that was a bestseller both in Germany as well as in Korea is called The Burnout Society, and he's really exploring how both in the West as well as in Asia there's just this continued drive more and more and more, and it leads to this deep sense of burnout. And so this creating a waiting space where we wait with each other is not only a way, importantly, to be attentive to God speaking to us, God leading us, but it also is a way of pushing back against this burnout society and this kind of sense that what gives anyone value is the more you do, and trying to get more done. For digital spaces, it feels like it never ends. And we have all sorts of studies, their phones under their bed so they can stay always moving, always doing more. And so it is really, I think it's a conversation for us to think about, probably across our shared contexts of thinking about how, especially in, like you said, in our urban settings, burnout in just continued action becomes makes me think something about the ontological structure, the beingness that it gets, or when all we feel like the only way to survive in our very competitive societies through performance, that we're always trying to perform, which again is why I think parents really work hard to give their children all those activities, is because they feel like they have to perform. And it even goes deeper into your ontological question, which is, and maybe this is very American, so you can tell me, but the centrality of happiness becomes just overwhelming. That the goal here is so our kids can be happy, not necessarily good, not necessarily have depth and perspective, not be connected to a larger tradition or story, which I think is actually more formative and important. There's this certain sense that happiness is the greatest end that the human being could get to. And I think across our traditions, it's just very, most of our ancestors would not have thought that happiness was something to give your life to. I mean, if you should take it, like happiness is like free money. If someone wants to give it to you, maybe, you should take it. No one should be mad at happiness, but to live for happiness, is not something that is deep enough really to fill out a human life. And yet in North America, almost every parent will say that all they want for their kid is to be happy. We'll say that myself often, like, oh, we just want our kids to be happy. And I get that. I say that, but it also is quite a shallow of, there's got to be something deeper than that. So those are kind of all fit into that, the question, to our being, if the end of the days are for our being happy and not something deeper and not a, and that's where joy is. And like I said, part of the grand joy became a central element of joyness is by something that is outside of you that changes you. Happiness is self I am, where joy of what is dead and made alive.
Astaga, keluar gua. Ampun. Kita keluar.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting talk. Now, if anyone has any questions, I'm sure Professor Ruth will be pleased to answer them. Maybe from this room, is there any question? Hendra, maybe, or Hermanto, or maybe Left Randy. In our YouTube channel,
your whole life, or when you hear the story in your congregation about how, and agree to the story, but the story in a kind of incarnational way is always lived out in the people who proclaim it and the people who narrate it to the next generation. And my experience in the churches here in North America is that it's very rare. It's unusual for the adults to narrate the depth of the Christian story to their own children. That usually, and this is part of with youth ministry, and particularly as it comes from in the North American vein, the youth pastor talks to the young people about God, as opposed to thinking that the youth worker's job, this is what I hope my students will do, is that they'll think that the youth worker's job, the youth pastor's job, is to know the stories of the other adults in the community and to invite them to share their stories, to help them give their testimony to their kids. And when I say testimony, I don't always mean just a kind of nice 3-arc story of a testimony where, things were going, then things got really bad, and I got pulled into a evil drug cartel. Then I found Jesus, and now everything's okay. The big dramatic kind of story. I think sometimes the kind of testimonies that our young people need to be exposed to and really wrestle with are people in the middle of it, who like the that are in the dark night of the soul. People say, your youth pastor asked me to share a story with you all, and I don't know where God is. I feel like God is absent from me. Our daughter's been sick for 6 months, and we've been looking for a cure and trying to figure out what's wrong. And I just feel God so far away from me right now. I'm still here at this church, but I can't even pray right now. I need other people to pray for me. And I know you all are reading Romans right now, and you're reading the verse in Romans that God works all things out. Love God, and I believe that. I really do. But right now, I just don't, there's not a lot of good going on in my life with our daughter sick. And those kind of stories too need to be shared, and allowing young people to really wrestle with, well, what is a lifetime and who is God in the midst of it, and how do we make sense of our lives? And so I think there's a big piece of what it means to be the youth pastor. And I tell my own students this, and I don't know if this will make sense, but that we're wrong. We're in the wrong, we're doing something wrong if we think of the youth pastor as the youth's pastor, that you are the pastor to the youth. You can't think that way. You have to think of yourself as a pastor to this whole congregation who advocates and supports the young people. But your job is not to be the pastor to them, but to help the whole community be in ministry and care for their children. And that is a big job. That's a job that's really important. But it's not your job to be the only one who's speaking into young people's lives. And it's your to be set up in inviting people to share these stories, and then asking young people, well, what does this mean? What does this mean? Who is God then in the midst of this? Church, then how do we understand how God moves in our own lives? I think so. Back to the question, like that becomes the superiority of the Christian story. Like Paul, especially in 2 Corinthians, Paul is such a story, not in Hollywood glow. In all of the Corinthians, that he's not a great preacher and he don't think much of him. But what the power of his story is death, and he testifies to that he was on the road to Damascus. And so, yeah, it's a weak story, but its weakness is it's the power to take what is dead and make it alive. And so if we could help our young people be exposed to narratives and stories of people in our community, neighbors and family members, where God has moved out of death into new life, well, that would be incredibly formative. That would ruin their lives when they go to university or they go into the adult. If they could remember 10 or 12 stories of people testifying to the working of the Holy Spirit that in a really concrete way came into their experience of death and brought life out of it, I think they would be wrestling with the depth of the Christian story the rest of their life, and it would be incredibly formative.
Okay. Thank you, Ima. Thank you also for Professor Ruth. Okay, well, is there any question or any more question?
Maybe from me.
Okay, sure.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Ruth, to hear. Nice to. And I have one question for you. My question is: to tell to young people that sin is the main problem in their life, while they are anti-religious language in this secular age.
Yeah.
In short, how can I show that something is wrong with their life and they need the gospel? And how can I address the main problem in their life to be accepted by them? Yeah. That's my question.
It's a great question. Yeah. So it's like we're living in that the common language we would often or it seems to be hard to understand. And so I think we have a temptation then to not use words like, sin or other kind of heavy religious language. And maybe that's okay, but I do think that we shouldn't turn away too much from the reality that there is something there's something fundamentally wrong, that there's something that we need to be saved, there's a desire that we need to be saved from something. Now, that's a hard thing to talk about too. So to say that there's something fundamentally wrong, at least in my cultural context, people would start to get very uneasy with that, because we don't want to say like certain people are not good, or certain people should be perceived as less than. That would be, again, to violate the ethic of authenticity. So I think the way we need to actually talk about sin is to talk about it as fundamentally all have these deep experiences of sin, of being let down and letting down others. So this, I don't want to get too obscure, but for me, my definition of sin is kind of this Roman sense of the reality of death. So sin is death. It's this isolating reality. It's this deep broken relationship. And I think young people really do deeply understand broken relationship, how relationships get broken, and how there's a propensity within us. And I think this happens at least with young people in my country all the time, where you feel this deep temptation that if you hurt another person, if you make fun of another person, if you make another person like you're in a group of friends, and if you pick on this person and humiliate that person, no one will realize that you feel really insecure about yourself. And to me, that is an important sin is. That sin is this articulation that we hear, this haunting we hear from death that says, if you serve me, I will protect you from which the gospel story and the story why Paul articulate that we know to sin because Jesus Christ died, we need to fear death, so we don't have to serve death. It can't get us in anymore, so that we're neighbor, and so we can actually we're not vulnerable, that bad things, that you did a bad thing, you know, you're one dessert and you took two desserts, and there is something about sin that is doing bad things, but it's a deeper reality. It's a reality of isolation, of being pushed out. It's a connection, and that's what needs to be healed. So when the atonement, Jesus' death and resurrection, doesn't just give us a kind of an anti-venom of that keeps us from doing bad things. Death and resurrection over death, and death, but of new life. We should then move the willing to walk into death and suffering because we know our God moves within it. So sin is really becoming captive to death's reality and serving death, which means isolating, turning them, which means thinking that we control our own lives and that we don't need other people. And so I think it's one of the profound realities of original sin in the Genesis story. Is some theologians read it as Adam and Eve not doing the bad thing of eating the fruit, but wishing the characters, but wanting to be the creator, and beings.
Thank you for your answer. Very clear.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ruth. Due to time limits, we finally end part of this session. Before I close, I would like to invite Professor Ruth a statement regarding today's topic.
Yeah, I think my closing statement would first of all just be a word of thanks to you all, those of you on YouTube who have listened in, and those of you in the room for the great questions and the engaging conversation. And then I think that just the kind of final takeaway again is the importance of narrative and story over trying to kind of compete against this, and that youth ministry is really helping young people find their lives inside find their own life story inside the story of Jesus Christ, life, death, and resurrection. And that's an exciting and a beautiful thing to give our lives to.
Okay. Thank you. I would like to thank so much to the speaker for Professor Ruth for the informative and interesting presentation, and to the participants for the very active participation. hopefully the session will be beneficial for everybody. Ya, sebelum saya menutup diskusi malam hari ini, saya juga ingin menginformasikan bahwa untuk teman-teman rekan-rekan dari Belajar Teologi bahwa simposium akademik yang Church, Ecclesiology, and Eschatology Conversation yang diselenggarakan pada sampai Rabu 1 Maret 2022 pukul 9 hingga 15.30 via Zoom. Ada 3 topik utama yang dibahas di simposium kali ini, yaitu kitab suci, eklesiologi, dan eskatologi. Tema ini merupakan sebuah undangan untuk memikirkan atau mengimajinasikan kembali visi teologis gereja dan pelayanan Kristen di masa yang akan datang, khususnya di pasca pandemi begitu. Ada 3 makalah dari 3 keynote speakers, dan di hari kedua akan ada total 42 makalah yang akan dipresentasikan dalam 3 slot sesi. Pendaftarannya segitu.
Tanggal 21 terakhir.
Informasi selanjutnya dapat rekan-rekan dapatkan di website STT Saat atau www.seabs.ic.id atau Instagram STT Saat. Ya, terima kasih untuk semua partisipasinya. Mohon maaf kalau ada ketidaknyamanan, baik itu di dalam materi yang disampaikan atau mungkin di YouTube channel kalau ada mungkin saya dengar sinyal juga kurang baik gitu, ya kami minta maaf. Dan terima kasih, sampai jumpa di sesi belajar teologi berikutnya. See you.